Hello, and welcome to our program, Where God Weeps, a program where we speak about the situation of the suffering and persecuted church around the world. Today, we're coming to you from Beirut, Lebanon, a country which has suffered enormously over the last year, politically, economically, and most recently with a terrible explosion on August 4, 2020, in which over 200 were killed, 6,000 injured, and 300,000 left homeless. Lebanon today is a country in ruins. And to tell us more about the political, economic, and social situation, it's my great privilege to welcome Professor Habib Malik, an associate professor of history at the Lebanese American University here in Beirut. Professor, thank you for being with us here today in our program.
Thank you very much, Mark.
Professor, before we get into the situation of Lebanon itself, I'd like to draw attention a little bit to the geographic context in which Lebanon finds itself. Particularly, Lebanon today is surrounded by countries either at war or with a resurgence of Islamic fundamentalism. Can you give us a little bit of an understanding what's causing this resurgence of Islamic fundamentalists today?
Yes. You know, the region has no dearth of recurrent displays of fanaticism and religious radicalism. The latest manifestation of that is the turn of Turkey away from decades of secularism under the present leadership and towards a more Islamist form of rule. Then we have, of course, Iran, which has been putting forth this idea of what's known as Wilayat al-Faqih, which is the rule of the jurisconsult, and a kind of apocalyptic Mahdism in the Shiite context. And then recently we've had displays of ISIS and kind of Wahhabi extremism as well. Now, the Islamic State has been defeated in terms of its geographic spread, but the ideology is still there. And so we could very easily be staring at ISIS 2.0. So there is no shortage of various types of Islamic extremism in the region. And the conflict between a number of states and among themselves and also with Israel, now of course picked up mainly by Iran and Turkey, is also unsettling and still unresolved form of instability in the region. So all of these things make it very turbulent around a small country like Lebanon.
All of this has a tremendous impact on Christianity and on the Christians, and with various responses, either emigration, dhimitude, or conversion. What is the special role and vocation of Christians in the Middle East today?
Well, the presence of Christian communities that are native to the Middle East gives the Middle East a very healthy pluralist feature, and that's always important. But add to that the importance of freedom. In other words, you could have whole communities that have been deprived for whatever, you mentioned the word dhimitude, and that's exactly what that means. Non-Muslim communities, Christians, having succumbed at one point or the other, becoming second-class citizens in their own native land under Islamic rule. That's what dhimitude is. And sadly, the vast majority of Christian communities native to the region have had that fate befall them. The notable exception are the Christians of Lebanon, who have managed, at a great cost to themselves in terms of lives and resources over the centuries, they've managed to maintain some degree of freedom that is quite distinctive and noticeable. And despite the fact that Lebanon is a small country with multiple problems, remarkably, Lebanese society has remained the freest, really, in the Arab world.
Let's get a definition first of all, before we go down.
Okay.
What is dhimmi?
The word dhimmi means under the protection of, fi dhimmat al-Muslimin, under the protection of Muslims. That's the word, and if you take it at face value, you can misunderstand what actually goes on. In return for protection, meaning not being physically killed, Christians and Jews have to give up a whole range of freedoms and have to succumb to a whole range of conditions that are very restrictive. No public worship, no political activity, always deference to the majority. Their women are available to be married off to Muslims, but the reverse is not the case, and so on. And so all of these cumulatively become a recipe for gradual liquidation. You mentioned emigration. Yes, many Christians in the region over the centuries, when they have been faced with tremendous hardships, have found that the only alternative left would be to pack and leave. If they stay as Christians, they have to live as second-class citizens without freedom, or they may be subject to the third thing you mentioned, which is a kind of forced conversion.
How does that take place?
Well, the choices are simple. You either accept the second-class status and become a dhimmi, or you convert to Islam, or if you refuse both of these things, your only option left is to pack and leave. Otherwise, you have no protection, and therefore, in a sense, you are vulnerable to being attacked physically and possibly killed.
What is the present status of emigration in these areas, geographic Middle East? What are we looking at?
We're looking at a very dire situation, especially after the Islamic State in parts of Syria and Iraq and what they did to the Christians, the Yazidis, and so on. Many communities were decimated and they had to leave, and now coming back has not been an easy affair, because others, Kurds or others, have actually taken over some of these villages and some of these, and then many of the places where these communities lived were destroyed. So this has been a very, very traumatic period for such native non-Muslim communities. Lebanon has had periodic emigration bouts. You see, one of the biggest ones happened after the First World War, or during the First World War, because of the famine that happened here and Ottoman brutality. But then we've had several others, especially during the 1975 to 1990 conflict in Lebanon. And now, after the terrible explosion and after the recent economic collapse in the country, there is a danger that emigration will start picking up with the Christians here as well.
Blessed Pope John Paul II said, Lebanon is not a country, it is a message.
Yes.
What is the message of Lebanon to the Middle East, to this region?
Lebanon embodies free, open, pluralist coexistence. And that is something that a region like the Middle East, which really suffers from a freedom deficit, is badly in need of. Lebanon in the good times has had a very effective educational system that has radiated free inquiry, cultural flowering, and the life of the mind and the spirit in ways that the region really needed and was not used to. And so many graduates from the region who have come and studied in Lebanon went back and became quite prominent in their societies. Freedom, I think, is the key. I think Saint Pope John Paul II had that in mind. He realized that free society in such a difficult, challenging part of the world is very precious. And Lebanon was that. And we are hoping it will still be that. As I said a little earlier, despite all its problems, on many levels in terms of religious freedom and in terms of coexistence and basic values, Lebanon still has a freer society than most other Arab states.
Can you describe for me how this power sharing model works?
Yes. Essentially, Lebanon, according to the constitution, is a country that has 18 specific, distinct religious communities, or sects, if you like, and they're all recognized in the constitution. Proportionally speaking, the model is to kind of apportion power sharing among the leading groups. And if we kind of lump some of these 18 together, we end up having about a third who would be Sunnis, a third who would be Shiites, and a third who would be Christians, namely Maronites, Orthodox Protestants, and the rest. Now, Lebanon, since independence in 1943, operated more or less on the assumption that it's a 50-50 society between Christians and Muslims, and therefore that's how matters are apportioned. The top three posts are the presidency, the prime ministership, and the Speaker of Parliament are apportioned to the Maronites, the Sunnis, and the Shiites, respectively. And that has actually, it was an unwritten kind of agreement, but after the war, after 1990, it became enshrined in the new constitution. The problem we face is twofold. One, this system has devolved, sadly, into a system of dividing the spoils among some of the leaders of communities who served as warlords before, and then they became, if you will, the mega crooks that have plundered the country. So there's that degeneration of a power-sharing system into one of sharing the spoils. The other problem is, it is a system that is based on sectarian power sharing. And this has been criticized as being a bit obsolete. We need to look forward to something like a more secular model and so on. You know, my sense is that it's probably safer and makes more sense in a place like the Middle East to work with the given. The given is sectarian plurality. So let's find a system that accommodates that rather than trying to parachute secularism on a place like the Middle East where it just won't work that easily.
I'm going to come back to this because it's an important topic in and of itself.
Good.
But first of all, I want to understand, you mentioned this sharing of the spoils.
Yes.
Corruption, essentially.
Yes.
And there's been massive protests
Yes.
where protests across all of these sectarian lines have been taking place. Druze, Shia, Sunni, and for the first time, Shia bases have been criticizing Hezbollah. So the challenge is, what are the young people calling for?
A sign of hope is that the young generation is really far less beholden to traditional leaders, to political parties, and to these corrupt individuals who have actually plundered the country. That's a sign of hope. The other thing is that, you know, when the issue is hunger, when the issue is basic needs that are vanishing quickly, people tend to forget these other differences. And the young generation really wants a future, and they suddenly saw themselves robbed of that, and so they went into the streets very spontaneously. That is a good sign of hope. The other thing is, whether we're going to talk about Lebanon in terms of its current political structure or any future improvement or alternative to that, we need to address this issue within the present context. Lebanon today is a hostage country. It is a country under occupation. Who has taken it hostage? Iran. And through whom? Through the agency of their paramilitary proxies here, namely Hezbollah. So Lebanon, it's still freer than all the other Arab societies on many levels and indicators, but it is not free at this point under this kind of occupation to decide to change the system or tweak it in ways that would serve pluralism and serve freedom. And when some people who probably are sympathetic to Lebanon in the West say, well, you know, you need to deal with Hezbollah on your own, that's kind of like asking the hostage to get rid of the person pointing the gun at their heads. That's not going to be an easy job. So essentially, back to your basic question, the young people, when their slogan is all of them means all of them, they mean all of the leaders, regardless of their sectarian, they all need to go. They all need to go because there is no trust or confidence left in the young generation with the current leadership in Lebanon.
What are the potential positive opportunities, but what are the potential risks with this tabla rasa, we start again? What could happen? Let's start with the negative, because we've had some idea. What could negatively happen in this context?
Well, you know, there's an alliance today between, if you like, the looters, the plunderers, the crooks at the top, and those protecting them, who benefit from this system. Namely, there's an alliance between the mafia, the thieves, and the militia, namely Hezbollah. Now, breaking that alliance is not going to be easy, nor the alliance has been challenged in the streets, as you said, by these protests. But there are ways to shake it, and one way would be for a country like the United States, which has tremendous soft power and which can do, using something like the Global Magnitsky Act, it can go after the crooks with very little cost and no boots on the ground. Because the United States, the Treasury, and other agencies there know pretty much where this money is. So putting pressure, not just through sanctions, but through essentially giving these people the choice. You either return a certain amount of what you have plundered and get out of politics, or you face the brunt of sanctions, of seizure of all your assets because we know where they are, and no future movement to the West or anywhere. Now, if that takes place, this would start to dismantle this mafia-militia alliance, if you like.
The other risk, however, is a theocracy. The other risk is that Shiitism, for example, would come to the ascendant through these groups, and Lebanon's previously power-sharing model would suddenly be reduced to a one-party show.
Yeah, well, look, no single party, no matter how powerful, can actually rule Lebanon completely for any extended period of time. What we're going through right now, as I said, is a kind of an occupation, a hostage situation. This cannot become permanent. What we have in Lebanon's history is a series of sectarian triumphalisms, if you like. The Christians were in the ascendancy at one point. They have a lot to show for that. Cultural flowering, prosperity, and so on, but also problems on the level of leadership and what have you. Then we had a brief period after 1990 under the late Rafiq Hariri of a kind of Sunni ascendancy. But sadly, under the slogan of reconstruction after the war, the level of corruption and looting essentially took a quantum leap forward in that period. And then after the assassination of Rafiq Hariri and the departure of the Syrians, we entered into the latest phase of triumphalism, which is Shiite triumphalism. And this is and that triumphalism is now presiding over the collapse of Lebanon. Now, you tell me a theocracy. The way I see it, Hezbollah and Iran are served if the Lebanese people are totally impoverished, their back is to the wall, and then at the right moment, someone like China comes in and throws a lifeline to the Lebanese, who are exhausted at that point, and then grabbing onto that lifeline would start to change the very identity of Lebanon, which is traditionally Western/Arab. Thanks to Iran, huge walls have been built between Lebanon and its Arab extension. Iran and Hezbollah would love for Lebanon not to have any more meaningful Western connections. That's why they have been systematically blocking reforms that have been demanded by the International Monetary Fund and by President Macron in France and by the United States, because as conditions for helping Lebanon, they need to see some reforms. Well, they've been systematically blocked by the powers that be in Lebanon today, precisely in order for China to come in and wrench Lebanon away into something else, towards Iran, towards the East, towards China. We don't know.
I want to take one step away from the
Yes.
politics to the economics.
Yes.
We're looking at a situation where Lebanon has encountered extreme economic difficulties. It's defaulted on its debt. The currency has dropped by at least 80%.
Yes.
So a large part of this can be attributed to the corruption that we've experienced, we've talked about. What is the life on the streets today? If you could give us just a picture of what is it for a daily Lebanese? I've heard the phrase, for example, that the middle class are becoming poor and the poor are becoming destitute.
Absolutely, that's it. Lebanon was a prosperous country. The Lebanese have always been very active in terms of commerce and as middlemen and as transit regions between East and West and so on. So for Lebanon to have experienced this sudden collapse means something out of the ordinary has happened, and that's exactly what has happened in the last 20 to 25 years. Lebanon has been the victim of a systematic Ponzi scheme, basically run by this corrupt group of politicians, the former warlords, and now protected and encouraged by Hezbollah. It was based on borrow and steal. In other words, in the name of borrowing money for whatever reason, fixing the electricity, fixing infrastructure, reconstructing after the war, and so on, the money was basically stolen, put in the pockets of the politicians and their cronies. And this happened repeatedly. Several international conferences to help Lebanon were put together by very well-meaning donors outside, only to find this money just evaporate into the pockets of these crooks. So essentially the Lebanese have been victims of this, and they finally realized it when the currency began to collapse, when, as you said, the country defaulted on its debt for the first time, and the debt has risen to astronomical levels. No country can sustain this kind of thing. So all of this was unnecessary, but it happened because of corruption. And it happened because the geopolitics that have nurtured and protected this corruption have also benefited from it. And so this entire setup needs to be dismantled. I kind of suggested one way to go after the crooks. Now, Hezbollah is not a problem that can be settled in Lebanon by the Lebanese. It's a bigger problem. It has regional extensions and so on. But certainly taking the rug from underneath the feet of this mafia militia conglomerate, or cartel, if you want to call it, can start with squeezing the thieves.
August 4th,
Yes.
2020,
Yes.
an enormous explosion, as we know, decimated the port.
Yes.
And regrettably, because of the fact that historically the Christian quarter was around
Just around the port.
just around the port,
That's right.
the majority of the Christian homes and churches were damaged or destroyed, flattened. I mean,
Correct.
the radius was 10 kilometers. It was somebody described it as if it was, you take a bottle, you blow into the plastic air bottle, and then you suck the air back out. It was as if this pressure like
Absolutely,
this.
yeah.
Was this the cherry on the cake? Was this the watershed moment today in Lebanon where people finally said, it's enough, I'm out of here?
Many people have lost hope. That was the straw that broke the camel's back, as it were. Yes, it was the icing on the cake of Lebanon's piling up misery, if you will. That's why I think things have to be done for the sake of preserving this very precious commodity, which is homegrown freedom in the Middle East. Things have to be done to reassure the Christians and others in Lebanon that there is a future. I make a number of suggestions. One would be to create a fund abroad managed by impeccably ethical individuals and designed to be for future Lebanese generations. You know, Lebanon has many friends abroad. The Lebanese diaspora is very wealthy. They had their fingers burned many times by sending money to Lebanon only to find it disappear. But if a fund can be set up, managed by a few individuals of high profile and impeccable moral standing, this would re-infuse some degree of confidence and trust, and people will start to say, you know what, before I emigrate, why don't I kind of stick it out until this fund really becomes substantial to the point where it might be able to help my children with their education. It might be able to provide for something like a pension plan for the elderly. It might be able to be used for medical help and so on. That's the sort of thing that would help. For people to just see the explosion, the destruction after the explosion, and no hope beyond that is definitely a recipe for draining out, the remainder of people who can leave or have the means to leave. You asked me about destitution on the streets. I mean, the Lebanese have never been in a situation where the middle class, which was the backbone of the country, is practically gone. All of a sudden, people have no access to their money in banks anymore. There is no hard currency. And there are people actually looking for food in waste disposals and so on, which was unheard of on that scale in Lebanon. So yes, an infusion of real hope, not just words, needs to come in.
For the Christians, this power sharing is reliant on the fact that the populations have a certain relative relationship in terms of the population, in terms of the numbers.
Yes.
What is it that we can do, particularly for the Christians, to keep the Christians, as you mentioned? Is there something particular that we say, okay, we need to strengthen this Christian presence?
Yes.
How do we keep the Christian young families from running away?
Well, let's look at the strengths of Lebanon and let's try to reinforce them. Education, medicine, better infrastructure. Now, the problem is you don't want to give funding to these things through official or government channels because you're shooting yourself in the foot. The crooks are still in charge of the official channels. So credible NGOs, churches, and a lot has been done. I mean, since the explosion on August 4, many churches, many NGOs have stepped in to help, but the task is so enormous. People are homeless. You mentioned 300,000 without homes. I'm going a little step further. I'm saying helping not only to rebuild schools, but to make sure schools can open and function and not purely rely on tuition, which is very iffy when people don't have the means. We need to reassure families that their children can continue to go to school. Lebanon has a very strong educational sector that needs to be supported. We need to, especially in this day of the pandemic, we need to make sure that Lebanon's otherwise good medical sector can stand on its feet, hospitals can pay their bills and so on. And all of this needs to be done not through government or official channels, but directly to churches, to schools, to hospitals, to credible NGOs that are vetted. And because there are, again, there are rackets where people come and masquerade as NGOs and they're either government veiled government agencies, gongos as they're called, or they are fake, and we don't want that.
Professor Malik, thank you for having been with us today in our program.
Thank you, Mark.
And thank you, ladies and gentlemen, for having been with us today in our program, Where God Weeps. And if you'd like to know more about the situation of Lebanon, or perhaps how you might be able to help, I would encourage you to look at the contact information at the end of this program. And we look forward to seeing you next week. Take care.